Hello there, Active Asshole on Roids here with another nuclear-powered video aimed at taking the wind out from the sails of our right-wing reactionary not-so-loyal opposition. That's Active Asshole on Roids, kryptonite for conservatives. You excited? Boy, I sure am. Today, I'm going to be tackling an issue rarely touched upon by modern civil activists. We're going to look at the influence pre-World War II, pro-Hitler, pro-Italian, fascisti, and domestic fascist and Christian nationalist groups had on the development of the post-World War II hard right militia movement, the Christian right, and mainstream conservative thought. We will also briefly touch upon the utter failure of so-called mainstream conservatives in defining the boundaries of what distinguishes a post-World War II conservative from a right-leaning proto-fascist, and how their failure to do so has had dire ramifications for right-wing groups today and for the rest of America. With that said, let's dive into some goodies. Oh, I enjoy my work. Uh, Conservatives, are you enjoying yourselves? Uh, Like most of you out there, I've regarded seditious remarks by men such as James Yeager, Alex Jones, Ted Nugent, I just said Nugent, and figures such as Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers with a mix of amusement and pity. And I've often wondered from where this virulent strain of rightist reactionary anti-pluralist machismo crossbred with rural white Christian nationalism originated. In order to understand how people such as Alex Jones and Ted Nugent can be so unabashedly fool-headed, one has to first gain some historical perspective on how their particular interpretation of the Second Amendment came into vogue and how their particular understanding of the Constitution came into vogue among the American right. A good place to start would be to study how Depression era anti-populist groups like the Silver Legion of America and the Liberty League influenced post-World War II anti-pluralist groups like the John Birch Society, the Religious Right, and the Posse Comitatus. In the late 1920s, all the way into the middle of the Second World War, a whole who's who list of reactionary rightists, nationalists, sectarian, and fascist groups emerged in the United States. With the onset of the Great Depression, FDR and his New Deal coalition garnered much of the country's support. Of course, there were the 25 percenters that resented FDR and his coalition. From these 25 to 30% of the decidedly anti-FDR contingent of American society, populist and not so populist proto-fascist right-leaning groups emerged. Some, like William Dudley Pelley's pro-Hitler Silver Legions of America, also called the Silver Shirts, as well as the early pro-Italy Fascist League of America, and Father Charles Colin's Christian Front, were largely homegrown populist reactionary groups. Others, such as the German American Bund, received much of their financial support and backing from Hitler's Third Reich. Still others, such as the Wall Street-backed American Liberty League and the influential America First Committee founded by Charles Lindbergh, garnered much influence within the pre-World War II Old Right. Around the outset of World War II, the FBI began a massive crackdown on pro-Hitler and pro-Italian groups in the U.S. Many either died out or were driven underground entirely. Some notable figures, however, such as Michael Beach, who was the second in command of William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts, and former Huey Long supporter and Father Colin adversary turned ally Gerald L.K. Smith, continued to do their work out in broad daylight. On a side note, I'd like to add, and this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but this is just a side note. I'd like to add that in spite of existing laws banning American companies from doing business with an enemy nation, the father of American President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of U.S. President George W. Bush, Mr. Prescott Bush, who also served as the U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut, continued to do business with the Nazis. Just putting that out there, just so everybody knows. Shortly after war's end, the hard right began to recover, provided and provided with an opening by hardline anti-communism and the Red Scare. Newly formed groups like the anti-Semitic John Birch Society grew in influence. Some figures, such as Michael Beach, Gerald L.K. Smith, and William Potter Gale, regarded even the John Birch Society as being too moderate. Gale, a former lieutenant colonel who served in the U.S. Army in the Second World War, developed an anti-Semitic philosophy that would influence the post-World War II American militia from there on out up until the present date. To help propagate this exclusionary and violently anti-Semitic and anti-left belief system, Gale enshrined it within what would become the pseudo-legalistic blueprint for much of the post-World War II militia movement, whether it be the violent standoffs between tax protesters and law enforcement in the late 1960s in the Great Plains states like Nebraska and Arkansas, or the anti-Semitic trends that took place that took hold in the rural Midwest by storm during the farm crisis of the late 70s and early 80s, or the rise of the sovereign citizens movement and the upsurge of militia activity in the U.S. in the mid and late 90s, out of which came the Oklahoma City bombing and a slew of other reactionary hard militia domestic terrorist activities, of course, or the founding and development of groups like the Oath Keepers by ex-Ron Paul aide Stuart Rhodes in the spring of 2008, and neo-Nazi groups like Stormfront based in Arlington, Virginia. Let's remember, there was a massive upswing in these groups after Barack Obama was elected, because a lot of people on the American right were butthurt at the fact that they had their asses handed to them in 2008. And the FBI saw like a 700% increase in the membership of these groups. Okay, these same groups that went out of style, that went underground, or should I say, died out, because a Democrat was no longer in office during the Bush years, had a resurgence out, because every time there's a Democrat in the White House, the Republicans, they get mad and they start hollering about how they want to take up their arms and shoot the loyal opposition, or as Sharon Ingold once called them, Second Amendment remedies. The views men such as Alex Jones and Ted Nugent espouse are in fact very common on the right because of the influence of the John Birch Society and William Potter Gale's identity theology had on the rebirth of the American right after World War II. From the rise of Barry Goldwater to the founding of the religious right by Birchers such as R.J. Rushdoony, who himself developed Christian Reconstructionism, which was the forerunner of rightist evangelical theologies such as Christian Dominionism and Christian Dispensationalism as espoused by Texas pastor John Hagee. Timothy LaHaye, himself a John Bircher, wrote and authored the Left Behind book series, and Bircher Sarah Palin served half a term as governor of the state of Alaska and ran as John McCain's VP pick on the 2008 GOP ticket. William Potter Gale's Posse Comitatus template was propagated by Michael Beach, the very same Michael Beach who served as second in command of William Dudley Pelley's pro-Hitler Silver Legions during the Depression years. Michael Beach continued his efforts all the way up into 1943 when the feds finally took matters into their own hands and told that guy to shut up and stop being a pro-Hitler seditious bastard. During wartime, with the Nazis, for crying out loud. Jesus Christ. Again, the apples of the American right's bullshit never falls far from the tree. Through efforts by Beach, the identity theology went on to influence the sovereign citizens movement and domestic terrorists such as Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, and continues to influence what were once fringe elements of the right wing. With the advent of the Tea Party expressed by Freedom Works and men such as Dick Armey, with $200 million in financial seed from the billionaires David and Charles Koch, by the way, men who have practically bankrolled the Austrian School of Economics in the U.S., this anti-pluralist proto-fascism has been pushed further and further into the mainstream. Gerald L. K. Smith of both Charles Colin's Christian Front, as well as a former Share Our Wealth Huey Long supporter. Well, he used to support more equitable beliefs, but then later on turned to hardcore fascism, just like Father Colin did later on down the road. Because remember, initially Father Colin supported FDR until he got on his whole anti-communist screed and then went hardcore proto-fascist. Now, he went on after World War II to promote proto-fascism through groups like the America First Party and the Posse Comitatus, which later inspired the rise of the same people that I mentioned earlier. And people like Ron Paul and Stuart Rhodes, yeah. Oh yeah, almost forgot about the Paulite Messiah. He's a Bircher too, and has been a speaker at their yearly conventions for a while now. What about mainstream conservatives? Again, the second point of this video. What about mainstream conservatives? Certainly they've been trying diligently over the years to establish the boundaries of American post-war conservatism. Well, that's the thing. Could you really expect men such as William F. Buckley Jr. and Paul Weyrich, the Moses figure and the so-called founding father of the conservative movement, to really act as effective arbiters of what constitutes conservatism and what constitutes fascism? That is, can you really expect them to define the boundaries when William F. Buckley Jr. himself referred to the U.S. Constitution as just some document? The same William F. Buckley Jr. who supported the fascists in the Spanish Civil War and referred to Spanish fascist dictator Francisco Franco as the savior of Spanish civilization. The very same man who supported apartheid in South Africa. The very same William F. Buckley Jr. who supported the junta dictatorships in Latin America, most notably Pinochet's military dictatorship regime in Chile. The same William F. Buckley Jr. who voiced support for Jim Crow in the South at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. As for Paul Weyrich, the so-called founding father of conservatism and one of the co-founders of the Right-Wing Heritage Foundation and one of the early supporters of moral majority, I might add, this is a man who was virulently anti-democracy. He supported military dictatorships around the world every bit as much as old Buckley did. In fact, those very same fascist junta governments were used as a proving ground for ideas that the U.S. right-wing's think tank denizens wanted to try out in the United States. The ownership society concept proposed by U.S. President George W. Bush was in fact originally developed by Augusto Pinochet under the advisement of Milton Friedman. Considering all the fascist worship of mainstream right-wing politicians and figures, it's hard to picture them really doing anything to separate post-World War II American conservatism from its distant cousin or not so distant cousin in fascism. In conclusion, the scurrilous cries of "Obama is a fascist" and "Obama turned the country into a dictatorship" are the biggest organized act of sophism, logocide, historical revision, and projecting in the history of our nation. Words like Hitler, fascist, and tyranny have been ground under the heel of the American right's subversive wordplay. They have been turned into little more than rhetorical word bombs by a right wing mostly ignorant of its own historical connection to proto-fascism.